Welcome to Saga Thing, where we're putting the sagas of the Icelanders on trial. I'm John.
And I'm Andy. Before we get started, John, I think we should mention that our podcast, Saga Thing, is now on iTunes. So please consider subscribing and leaving a comment for us so that we get into the rankings.
Yes, please do. We've actually been really excited about the early response to this podcast. We sort of thought we were just doing this for ourselves, and maybe occasionally for some of our students to come by. And it's been really interesting and exciting to have an actual audience for this.
Yeah, it's nice to know that there's more people than just my wife listening.
I'm happy there's someone besides your wife listening, too. I don't think my wife is listening.
That said, she thinks we're very good at this.
Well, there you go.
That's nice. Now, John, there's one more bit of business we need to cover, and that regards the controversy over the Thingman choice of.
I don't remember there being any controversy.
There was controversy in that you hosed me and took Snorri Gothi. So I put up a poll to see if you were right or I was right, and it turns out we're both kind of wrong. Though there are
not the way I read the poll.
Right now, there's a tie between Snorri the Gothi and Kjartan the Seal Pounder, which is really surprising to me.
Well, which makes it sound like, in fact, I chose just fine, and you perhaps made a tactical error.
Could be. It could be. Maybe people just aren't that impressed with Arnkel. Look, I wanted to choose Kjartan. It just didn't seem to make sense at the time.
Well, that's all right.
I'm happy with my choice.
And the website that they can go to vote is?
I believe that is sagathingpodcast.wordpress.com.
There you go.
Is that true?
That's not a good sign. Well, time to get started. We've got something special set up for today, don't we?
Yes, we do. We are setting a course for the new world. In this episode of Saga Thing, we follow the adventures of Eirik the Red as he settles the shores of Greenland. Get to know his famous son, Leif the Lucky, who accidentally discovers the new world after abandoning his pregnant lover. You'll cry when Sigrid the farmer's wife learns of her impending death, and then laugh as her undead corpse tries to climb into bed with Thorstein Eriksson. Along the way, you'll meet Thorbjorg the Prophetess, a witch celebrity whose taste for the finer things in life knows no match. Will she have what it takes to end the famine in Greenland? But there's more. The New World calls, promising rich lands and much-needed resources. Join Thorfinn Karlsefni and his brutish companion Thorhall the Huntsman as they seek fame and glory in the wilds of North America. Will the natives welcome the Viking settlers with open arms, or will things turn violent? Find out this week in Eirik the Red Saga! We need like a little sounder like a ship going.
Well, surely our budget can stretch that far.
Yeah, maybe we'll add something here. Here, I'm going to add something.
All right. This is going to be great fun. The Icelandic voyages to North America, or Vinland as they called it, are part of the legend of the sagas.
And, of course, this is our first trip, but it won't be our last. There are actually two distinct but related sagas that tell this story. We're reading Eirik's saga today, but we will eventually return to another Vinland saga called the Greenlander saga at some point down the road.
Both of them are on the short side. Eirik's saga weighs in at only 7,910 words in the Icelandic, which, of course, means it's a mere 0.867 Hrafnkel sagas.
That is the most ridiculous way to measure sagas, but I guess it does demonstrate that this is the shortest saga that we've covered yet.
Yeah, and yet it's also our most well-traveled saga by far. We'll be visiting Norway, Iceland, Greenland, North America, the Hebrides, and a few other places that we can't necessarily identify.
Right.
But first things first. We've been referring to North America and Vinland as if they were interchangeable. How sure are we that that's a safe thing to do?
Well, it's pretty clear. In addition to the sagas and various other documents which corroborate them, there have been a number of important finds by archaeological teams. There's camps, trading posts, weapons, and so on that are found. The most famous site is Lons á Meadows, which was uncovered by the husband and wife team of Helga and Arnstein Ingstad. Did I say that right?
I believe so.
They walked around in the 1960s and almost certainly found proof of Scandinavian settlement in Vinland, or what we call Vinland, or they called Vinland. Most recently, in 2008, there was a dig that found substantial detritus and even architectural remains from an early Viking settlement on Baffin Island. It's actually impossible to be positive, but it's more or less established. And I think we're going to be posting some video links and maps and stuff like that on the website. You can check that out.
Yeah, some good stuff. Definitely worth looking at. So Eirik's saga tells a story of settlement and exploration in North America, and apparently it's a more or less true story. So we'll hedge our bets and say that this saga was inspired by true events. It's good enough for Hollywood, it's good enough for us.
Yeah.
So it may have been based on a real voyage, but there are some issues with the saga as it comes down to us.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as we go through the saga, and if you sit down and read it yourself, you'll see, I don't want to take this thing word for word, but we're going to assume that Greenlanders did travel over to North America. They did try to establish settlements. They likely tried to trade with Native Americans. Beyond that, I don't want to get much farther into accepting what this saga presents.
Fair enough.
So let's go through this ourselves, and we can come to our own conclusions either way.
Excellent. Our story begins with a brief biography of Aud the Deep-Minded, one of the settlement age figures who shows up in plenty of sagas. She's a matriarch of early Iceland. After the deaths of her husband and son, Aud moves to Iceland, where she stays for a while with her brother, Bjorn the Easterner.
Now, everyone may remember Bjorn the Easterner from our last episode. He was the patriarch of the Kjalaklings in Eyrbyggja Saga.
Right. His sister Aud arrives already having been Christianized.
And if you remember from Eyrbyggja Saga, Bjorn, he knows she's Christian and doesn't quite like it very much.
Right. So she has to sort of establish her own separate holy place, which she does at Cross Hills. She brings with her a group of men who are then given land of their own. Among them is Vifil, a freed slave who has two sons named Thorbjorn and Thorgir Vifilsson. And around the same time, Eirik the Red and his father Thorvald Osvaldarsson are forced to leave Norway due to some killings.
It's very, very vaguely stated. They just had to leave because of some killings. We need to talk about that for a couple of reasons. One is our usual complaint about how vague the sagas can be when it comes to the number of killings. And John and I have already had our argument about how many killings occur in this saga. The other thing that we need to think about is the sort of pattern we're going to continue to see from Eirik.
He's definitely a man with anger control issues.
He certainly is. Now, some people might say he gets the name Eirik the Red because he's not very good at counting to 10 and praying for world peace. It's also supposed that he had red hair, and his name is Eirik the Red or Eirik the Ginger.
Although in this case, I think we can assume it's a happy coincidence that he has red hair.
Right.
Anyway, his father Thorvald dies shortly after their arrival in Iceland, and Eirik marries Thjodhild, the daughter of Jorund Ulfsson and Thorbjorg Shipbreast. He sets up a farm.
I'm sorry, did you just say Thorbjorg Shipbreast?
Yes.
Well, I think we can shut down the old best nickname category right now. She's going to be the winner.
Give the rest of the saga a chance, will you?
Who doesn't love a broad-chested woman?
Yes. Eirik sets up a farm. Eirik and his wife set up a farm near Vatnsjorn called Erikstad, but his slaves start a landslide on his neighbor's land. It's not clear whether this is deliberate or not, but since they're Erik's men, I'm going to say that it was totally intentional. Either way, his neighbor's kinsman, Eyjolf Saur, kills the slaves in retaliation. Eirik reacts somewhat predictably, killing both Eyjolf and another man, Holmganghrafn, or Hrafn the Dueler.
So the pattern that we're seeing here is that Eirik settles somewhere, meets his neighbors, and then kills them.
Pretty much, yeah.
I like this guy. He's refreshingly uncomplicated, isn't he?
There's a case brought to the local thing, and Eirik is banished from the area. He next settles Oxen Island, where, brace yourself, he names his home Erikstad and gets into a disagreement with a neighbor.
Yeah, that's a little different, though. Now, Eirik loans a set of bench boards to his neighbor Thorgest of Bredabolstad. And then when he asks for those boards back, Thorgest doesn't send them. So Eirik goes to Thorgest's home with a bunch of friends and seizes them. Now, when the men of Thorgest's household chase Eirik's group to get him back, there's a big fight. Several men are killed, including two of Thorgest's sons.
Right, so the pattern holds.
Absolutely.
Eirik just puts everyone within a mile of him into the categories people I'm going to kill and people I might decide to kill later.
So in this case, there's at least a little bit of justification for his actions. He lent the boards, and Thorgest kept them. When you're dealing with someone like Eirik, that's not so smart. You give the boards back when he asks for them. Besides, Eirik does pay the price again. He receives a sentence of minor outlawry despite some very powerful supporters that include our Eyrbyggja Saga friends, the Thorbrensons, and Killer Stur.
Well, the Vifilssons help him to escape, and Eirik spends the next 3 years establishing a presence in Greenland by naming everything in sight after himself. Erik's Holmes, Erik's Island, Erik's Fjord, and so forth.
Yeah, but John, if you were the first guy to land in all these places, wouldn't you do the same thing?
I suppose I might, but,
John's home.
I mean, John's Fjord has a certain ring to it, I guess.
I like Andrew's Fjord. Sounds good.
There you go.
Anyway, but Erik's not the sort of guy to give up on a feud, is he? He comes back.
What do you mean?
Well, after 3 years, of exploring and looking around at Greenland, he comes right back to Iceland and picks another fight with guess who? Thorgest.
Oh, with Thorgest, yeah, that.
Yeah.
It's not really covered in much detail, though.
No, it's kind of disappointing. It does say there's another battle, and it says that Eirik loses this one. He doesn't lose his life or any limbs, but Thorgest is resistant to Eirik's kill everybody strategy. Eirik gives up this time and goes back to Greenland. So, John, why do you think Eirik ends up going back to Greenland and not anywhere else?
Well, I think he's kind of running out of places to live. I mean, his migration is sort of this westward pattern. As he's exiled from one place, he sort of heads out further west, and now in Greenland, he's kind of at the edge of what the Scandinavians thought of as being the livable land.
Right. So the real issue is he's not welcome anywhere else, right?
Right. Well, again, he's not
west.
a popular neighbor. He's not a guy you want around.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, the Vifilsons have been busy raising their families. Thorbjorn Vifilsson has a daughter named Gudrid, who's growing up to be quite beautiful. But Thorbjorn's finding money a little tight. So after a nouveau riche trader proposes marriage to Gudrid in exchange for helping Thorbjorn out financially, Thorbjorn, who's highly offended by this, resolves to move his family to Greenland to be with Eirik. He takes about 30 people with him on the journey, but the ship hits rough weather, and then an outbreak of disease kills half the people on board, including Gudrid's foster parents. They finally reach Greenland in terrible shape, and they disembark at Herjolfsnes, where they stay with a man named Thorkel.
Well, and things aren't going to be any better for them when they land, because Greenland, at the time, is suffering from a great famine.
Yeah, Thorbjorn really doesn't have any luck at all. Fortunately, though, there's a bit of entertainment at Thorkel's place. He invites Thorbjorg the Prophetess to his farm to foretell the end of the famine, and maybe do a little fortune-telling.
Yeah, and she's a really interesting character. She's a bit of a diva, and everything has to be just so for her.
In what way?
Well, she has to be escorted to Thorkel's farm, where she's going to be seated on a high seat.
That's just good hospitality.
Well, the seat must have a nice cushion as well.
But isn't it said, a guest is a jewel resting on a cushion of hospitality?
Where do you pull that out from?
Rex Stout wrote that.
You're a font. I don't know who that is either. You're a font of odd proverbs and weird quotes. Yes, there's a cushion. It is hospitality, but the cushion in this case has to be stuffed with nothing but hen's feathers.
Diva.
Yeah, that's what I said. Now, in fairness, it was an act of hospitality, but this is special hospitality. This is a woman that everyone is excited to have come. In fact, the saga gives a good description of her and her lovely clothes. When she arrived one evening, along with the man who had been sent to fetch her, she was wearing a black mantle with a strap, which was adorned with precious stones right down to the hem. About her neck, she wore a string of glass beads, and on her head a hood of black lambskin lined with white catskin. She bore a staff with a knob at the top, adorned with brass set with stones on top. About her waist she had a linked charm belt with a large purse. In it she kept the charms which she needed for her predictions. She wore calfskin boots lined with fur, with long sturdy laces and large pewter knobs on the ends. On her hands she wore gloves of catskin, white and lined with fur. She's clearly a Greenland celebrity.
Yeah, and she acts like it. She arrives, settles herself on her hen feather pillow, and begins the show.
Right.
She presses Gudrid into service, helping her with her rituals, which makes Gudrid a little uncomfortable since she's a Christian. But she doesn't want to be rude, so she pitches in. And in return, she gets her fortune told.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's not just that she doesn't want to be rude, it's that she's a Christian and doesn't want to participate in a heathen practice, but she also says that she was taught these chants as a little girl by her foster mother. And so she gets involved and sings so beautifully that Thorbjorg is moved, and indeed all the spirits that they were calling to help them out are deeply moved by Gudrid's beautiful voice. And so this leads to a prophecy. The first thing she predicts is that the famine will end soon, which turns out to be true. She also gives or rewards Gudrid with a prophecy about her life and what's going to happen. And the gist of it is basically that she's going to get married, and that first marriage is going to be very, very short, and then she's going to marry again and have a lot of prosperity. And
return to Iceland, I believe.
Yeah, she'll have a lot of prosperity and return to Iceland, exactly. The next thing that happens is Thorbjorn takes Gudrid with him to Eirik's settlement, and there they establish a homestead. But Gudrid is left with this prophecy hanging over her head about her first husband dying quickly.
So the narrative brings us back to Eirik's family. Eirik the Red has two legitimate sons, Thorstein and Leif. Leif is a roamer, and he sails away over the seas.
Does he go to Vinland, John?
No, to the Hebrides, where he has a bit of a summer fling with a woman named Thorgunna.
Another of our friends from the last episode, Thorgunna of the Haunted Bedsheets.
Yeah, that's her. When Leif is getting ready to leave at the summer's end, Thorgunna asks to go with him, but Leif refuses to take her without her family's permission. Of course, since he's already sort of taken her without her family's permission, Thorgunna informs him that she's carrying his child. Leif leaves her behind anyway, and next thing he heads to...
It's Vinland. It's Vinland this time.
No, to Norway, where he visits the court of Olaf Tryggvason.
Okay, so timeline-wise, we know this has got to be around 995 to 1000, right around the conversion of Iceland, right?
Right, exactly. And Olaf's the guy who's pressuring everyone in Scandinavia to convert. Leif gets caught up in this when Olaf deputizes him to go convert Greenland. So Leif heads back out to sea again, but this time he's blown off course, and after sailing a while, he makes land in a new place he's never seen before.
Is it Vinland this time?
Yes.
Oh, good.
Of course, he doesn't really know where he is.
About time to get there. No, he doesn't know where he is. But it is a promising-looking place. He sees everywhere around him wild wheat growing, there's plentiful forests, and various edible growths. To a lost Greenlander, even to an Icelander, this would be paradise.
Right, but of course, Leif can't stay. He's on a mission from a king, and so he turns around and heads back to Greenland, where he converts a number of people, including his own mother.
Yeah, not his father, though.
Right.
Maybe I want
right. Eric's not really Christian material, but it does make for a bit of marital strife.
Yeah. Yeah, the saga reads, after her conversion, Thjodhild refused to sleep with Eirik, much to his displeasure.
I notice he's not displeased enough to convert, however.
Exactly, but still, it would be displeasing. I guess in that time, he probably had other women with him that he could take advantage of.
Yeah, perhaps. Which would explain the illegitimate sons that come up later on.
That does
there you go.
Explain it.
So Leif is trying to convert Greenland, but all anyone wants to talk about is this new land that he's found. Leif's brother Thorstein leads an expedition, but a combination of bad weather and, frankly, incompetence means that they spend the autumn sailing around in the North Atlantic, at various times spotting Iceland and Ireland, before returning to Greenland for the winter, where the ever-compassionate Eirik mocks their failure.
Okay, now this is a time where we should address one of the issues of this saga that we haven't really talked about. There's a problem of manuscripts. We have multiple manuscripts with different versions of this saga, with kind of minor differences. But it's worth mentioning that the sources seem confused about whether Eirik the Red is actually on this ship with his son or not during this journey. I know in Greenlander saga, for example, he does not go on the ship. In one of the Eirik saga manuscripts, Eirik says something like, "You seem to have been bent over by a troll," but in another version he says, "We have been bent over by a troll."
Bent over by a troll?
Well, it's just a loose translation. Basically,
it's a
what
very
Eirik
loose translation. What he says, in essence, is that you seem unhappier than you were when you left.
Well, he's not just saying that you're less happy. He's saying we didn't really accomplish anything on that mission, or you didn't accomplish anything. Because what happens is they just kind of get blown around the ocean for a while, and then they come home.
And by the way, it really is. It's an embarrassing trip. I mean, if you know the North Atlantic at all, to be heading from Greenland to North America and to end up in Iceland and Ireland, that's pretty bad.
Right.
And as we mentioned earlier, I mean, this whole saga can be second-guessed. I mean, since there's the Greenlander saga around, which is going to tell the same story with a lot of notable differences.
Yeah. And Eirik stays home in that one after a horse throws him, and he takes it as a bad omen. What the Greenlander saga doesn't have that the Eirik saga does is Eirik falling off his horse and saying, "Ow, ow, ow." Which
is that a translation? But
that's what my translation says, "Ow, ow, ow." And you don't see that in medieval literature too much.
No.
So I kind of like that one.
It lacks that stoic quality.
It certainly does. It feels very real. So what you would say, "Ow." Anyway, so the point of him being thrown off the horse is that he regards it as a bad omen. In this saga, he's not given such, or he doesn't interpret it as a sign. He's just kind of snarky toward his son and about the whole trip in general.
Well, at least he stopped randomly killing people.
Well, there's fewer people around.
So Thorstein Eriksson stays the winter with his father and makes good use of the delay by marrying Gudrid Thorbjorn's daughter.
Yeah, this is the same Gudrid who was told by a seeress that her first marriage was not going to last very long.
That's her.
Did no one tell Thorstein about this?
Well, it's sort of an awkward thing to bring up at a wedding.
Yeah, but it's kind of important information.
It would be.
Anyway, this isn't going to be a very happy marriage, I guess.
Well, it might be happy. It's just not going to be very long. An outbreak of disease hits Eric's farmstead that same winter, and several people die. And of course, I know you love a good undead story.
Well, who doesn't?
Well, I hope everyone does, because the dead at Eric's farm don't stay down.
That's right. There's a dead woman named Sigrid who tries to get in bed with Thorstein Eriksson. It's kind of a weird episode. In fact, what we're talking about here is a moment where Sigrid is still alive, and she gets up to look outside, and what she kind of reports what she sees. She says, "I'm not going to go outside with things as they are. All of those who are dead are standing there before the door, and among them I recognize Thorstein and myself as well. How horrible it is to see." So here you have the living Sigrid looking outside and seeing a dead version of herself and a dead version of Thorstein Eriksson. So it is a pretty terrifying thing. And long story short, Sigrid does die. She tries to sleep with Thorstein Eriksson. He ends up getting sick and he dies. And in the night, Thorstein's corpse sits up and asks to speak to his wife Gudrid. And when she comes to him, he whispers a few words to her that only she can hear.
What are they?
Well, it depends on what translation you're looking at. In one translation, it says only she can hear them.
Wait, so the saga writer lost in translations us? Unbelievable.
Yeah, in that version anyway. But there's other translations that suggest he spoke to her softly so that only she could hear, and this is what he said. Basically, he gives instructions encouraging conversion of Greenland, and he encourages generous donations to the church. He asks to be buried in consecrated ground. He explains that other people need to be buried in consecrated ground, and he lies down again. So this disease is still around, and Gudrid's father also dies before the winter's over. So she's pretty much alone, but she now inherits a lot of money.
Well, and she's not alone for long, because a new crowd of men is coming to Greenland. Chief among them, Thorfinn Karlsefni. Karlsefni and some other men stay with Eirik the following winter, and Karlsefni impresses Eirik with his generosity.
In other words, he lets Eirik sponge off him for a while, doesn't he?
Yeah, but he's got an ulterior motive. He wants to marry Gudrid. And with her husband and father both dead, Eirik has a certain amount of influence there. Eirik agrees to the match, and Gudrid is remarried.
Not one for mourning long, is she?
Well, she and Karlsefni are both active types. And in fact, they're soon talking about attempting another voyage to retrace Leif Eriksson's trip to Vinland. They put together a band of the most promising men and women around. All told, they gather about 160 people for the trip.
Though that's debatable, with some of the translations say 140, others say 160.
Right. The crew, it includes Eirik the Red's illegitimate daughter, Freydis, her husband, Thorvard, and her brother, Thorvald Eriksson. It includes Erik's friend, Thorhall the Hunter. It includes an accomplished trader named Bjarni Grimolfsson, and Snorri Thorbrandsson and his son, Thorbrand Snorrisson.
Yeah, if you're really obsessive, you might remember Snorri Thorbrandsson from Eyrbyggja Saga. He's the one that got the arrow through his mouth after the Battle of Vigraford and couldn't eat at Snorri's table.
That's rough. Anyway, on the second attempt, the explorers are successfully able to cross to what we now call North America, and they make landfall in several locations.
Now, this section is pretty tricky. It's written with a great deal of detail in terms of Karlsefni's movements and the nature of the various places, but it's almost impossible to pin down where exactly he is at any given moment. I guess the problem is that we're not sure where his first landing spot is, and everything is built off of that information. Now, trying to recreate it, it basically seems like they're pinballing around the area of Baffin Island and Newfoundland. Maybe they start up around Baffin Island, which they call Helluland, and then they go down a little bit south to an island that they call Bjarni, because of all the wildlife they see there, and then on to what is Markland, and into what they think is Vinland, or what is now Newfoundland. But it's hard to be totally sure what exactly is going on there. There are plenty of maps trying to recreate what's going on, and we'll, again, post some of that stuff on our blog. But they're having a good time exploring. The land's so beautiful, and all they want to do is sightsee and hang out.
Right, which means that when winter comes, they're not fully prepared. Their livestock does well on the abundant grass, but there's not much to eat otherwise. And despite their prayers to God, they don't have much success hunting. Now, it's at this time that Thorhall the Hunter, who's one of the few pagans on the journey, disappears for a couple of days, and the others find him standing on a promontory, scratching himself and mumbling. They ask him what he's doing, and he gets surly and refuses to tell them.
Yeah, he actually uses the old, I'm old enough to look after myself kind of line.
Right, and nobody really likes Thorhall, so they're willing to drop the subject.
Yeah.
Soon after this episode, though, a dead whale washes up on shore. It's a whale of a kind none of them recognize, not even Karlsefni, who we're told is an expert on whales. But they're hungry, so they cut it up and eat some of it. But almost immediately they start feeling sick from the meat. Thorhall brags, then, that his prayer to Thor brought the whale, when everyone else's prayers to Christ did nothing. And the group decides they're being poisoned by this pagan whale gift and get rid of it. Once they do that, the weather improves, and they're able to go out fishing.
Exactly. But Thorhall and Karlsefni now know that they can't trust one another. So Thorhall splits off from the main group and says he's going to head north or just leave them. He's got about 9 others with him. And the main group under Karlsefni is going to head south. But it turns out Thorhall's not much of a navigator. His ship is blown off course. He is blown all the way over to Ireland, and it says he is very quickly captured, beaten, and killed among the Irish. So
Yeah.
I guess Thorhall's people skills hadn't improved any by the time he got there.
No. Meanwhile, not knowing what's happened to him, Karlsefni's group heads south, where they find a paradise, an estuary with wild crops and fish teeming in the water. They live the high life for a couple of weeks, until one day they spot a group of natives in skin boats approaching. Snorri Thorbrandsson suggests approaching them under a white shield of peace.
Yeah, that's right. What I find interesting about the saga from this moment forward, it kind of becomes an interesting saga finally, is the treatment of the natives. In this case, they're described as short in height with threatening features and tangled hair on their heads. Their eyes were large and their cheeks broad.
And after a short visit, the natives leave peacefully.
Now, that doesn't worry anyone, seeing these natives kind of staring at them?
No, apparently not. They don't leave the area, and the following spring, a much larger group of natives arrives and begins trading with Karlsefni's people.
Right. They're trading, and one of the things that the saga mentions is that the natives are particularly interested in 2 things. One is the red cloth that the Greenlanders have with them, and the other is their weapons. Karlsefni and Snorri say, don't give them any weapons, but go ahead and sell them all the cloth you want. So they get all these pelts and other goods.
Right. Everything goes well until a bull belonging to the Icelanders gets loose and runs wild through the woods, terrifying and driving off the native group.
So at this point, anyone would know enough to go find somewhere else to live, wouldn't they?
Well, anyone else would, but Karlsefni's people are either braver or stupider than us, because once again they stay put. 3 weeks later, a horde of the natives returns, and this time they're ready for a fight.
And this time the Greenlanders don't grab their white shields, they grab their red shields. A nice indicator of intent there. And it's really a hell of a fight. The natives have these weird catapult things. It's kind of a long pole that they put a ball on the end of, and then they kind of fling it, and it creates some kind of magical fear in the Greenlanders. But they've also got their spears, bow and arrows, things like that. And the Icelanders are forced to flee. Now, Thorbrand Snorrisson is killed in this battle, and Freydis, Eric's daughter, the illegitimate daughter of Eric, takes up a sword to fight the natives herself. She ends up...
and it's worth noting that she's pregnant at this point.
Absolutely. It says she moves a little bit more slowly because she's pregnant. So you've got this pregnant Scandinavian warrior woman squaring up against a group of natives. She scares them off like an Amazon, bearing one breast and slapping it with Thorbrand's sword.
I can see why that would be terrifying.
Yeah, no kidding.
Meanwhile, Karlsefni's people retreat to their ships and eventually decide they can't remain in this new land if the natives don't want them there, showing rather more good sense than some later Europeans would show. Before they leave, though, Karlsefni and Thorvald Eriksson take a ship to go looking for Thorhall the Hunter's group, which they still believe is somewhere nearby. They make landfall one day, and they see a Uniped in a clearing. They call out to it.
Did you say a Uniped? What's a Uniped doing in this saga? It's very weird.
I don't know.
I'm not even sure that I read it that way, but go ahead.
For those of you not familiar with them, Unipeds are one-legged, giant-footed men, sometimes described in medieval European texts, mostly travel literature. They're described as living in far-off lands, but usually they're supposed to be way off in Africa or Asia somewhere.
Yeah, maybe one of them got lost.
I think it's more likely that our author had always wanted to stick a Uniped in one of his stories, and he saw his opportunity.
Yeah, it's possible. I know that in other sagas, I mean, the word that they use to describe the Uniped here is the Einvater, that is a one-footed being, or just the one-footed. And if you look at other sagas, if you look for that word, you'll see that it's usually used to describe men who have lost a leg. So, for example, Onund Treefoot in Gretche's saga is called Einvater, as well as Treefoot. So it could just be a one-legged native.
Right, although in this case, because it's described as a one-footer and not a one-footed native, I think we are dealing with a Uniped, which is odd, but kind of pleases me.
Yeah.
And whatever it is, it's more than just a random cameo. I mean, there's a reason why we're focusing on this. Because the Uniped is armed. It fires an arrow and kills Thorvald Eriksson before running away.
Before it hops away, you mean?
Oh, yes. Well, pogoing along for all it's worth.
Right.
The rest of the party, at this point, gives up on the search and returns to the main group.
Now, sometime later, nervous about a native attack and dealing with the internal unrest over a shortage of women, which is understandable, the men decide to head back to Greenland. They'd spent about 3 years in this strange new world and decided it was time to go home. But the trip home isn't entirely as smooth as they hoped for.
Yeah, not entirely. Karlsefni's ship makes it back without major incident, but the larger ship, piloted by Bjarni Grimmelsen, is blown off course and begins to sink. And there's only one large rowboat available, and even stuffed full, it can only carry half the 100 or so people on board. Bjarni has lots drawn for places on the rowboat, and Bjarni himself draws one of the lucky straws.
Yeah, so he doesn't believe in that old captain goes down with the ship thing, does he?
No, but it doesn't mean he won't end up that way. Because as the rowboat full of lucky winners is about to cast off, an Icelander left on the sinking ship guilt trips Bjarni into switching places with him. So in the end, Bjarni goes down with the ship and a bunch of other men, thus dying nobly while also massively improving the Saga's body count.
Right, except we might not be able to count them, right?
Well, we'll figure that out when we get to that point.
Well, that's pretty much it. The saga includes a final short chapter telling us that Karlsefni and Gudrid eventually moved back to Iceland and raised their children there, kind of fulfilling the prophecy that she was given about her life. But that's where the story ends.
But of course, that's not where we end, because we now need to put Eric's saga through the ringer of our judgment section.
And it deserves it.
Absolutely. As always, we'll evaluate the saga according to several criteria: best bloodshed, body count, nicknames, notable witticisms, Outlawry and Thingman, in which we must each choose a figure from the saga to join our all-star team of supporters for the All Thing, and final ratings, our assessment of the saga on a scale of 1 to 10.
Okay, well, let's get started.
Best bloodshed.
All right, so this is best bloodshed, and in this saga, John, whereas we had a lot of stuff to choose from in Eirik Saga, not quite so much to choose from here.
Yeah, I kind of wish we had saved a couple of the bloodshed moments from Eirik Saga and just imported them into this one.
Just bring them over,
cover.
Yeah, so in this case, we'll move pretty quickly, because I have one, and I think you have one, right?
I have one nominee.
I have one nominee as well.
Excellent. I'm going to nominate Thorvald Eriksson. Thorvald is Eirik the Red's son, and he accompanies Karlsefni on his ill-fated voyage north to find out what happened to Thorhall the Hunter's group. He's with Karlsefni when they run into the Uniped, or possibly a one-legged native.
But definitely Uniped.
And it's he who is shot by the Uniped. He actually receives an arrow in... Receives.
He welcomes it with open arms.
Hello! I've got a nice shaved spot for you. I'm going to nominate Thorvald Eriksson.
All the way back to the beginning?
No, well, not if you keep saying things. I'm going to nominate Thorvald Eriksson. He's traveling with Karlsefni on their trip north to find out what happened to Thorhall the Hunter's party when they run into the Uniped, who we decided is a Uniped and probably not just a one-legged native.
Most definitely.
It's Thorvald who is shot in the groin by the Uniped's arrow. And I think this may be unique in the sagas. I don't think anyone else is ever killed by a Uniped in the sagas.
Definitely not. Or even exotic beasts of any kind. Right. Unless you're talking about legendary sagas or things like that. You're just not going to see weird creatures like that.
So I think it's worth listing just for that.
Absolutely. And I'm going to throw in, as you know, I love the undead, and I'm going to go to Sigrid. Sigrid's death, or actually it's her second death. If you remember, Sigrid is the woman who is caught up in that whole famine and plague business. And she sees herself dying and does die. And one day, Thorstein Eriksson is trying to lay down in bed, and this zombie woman, or this undead woman, keeps trying to climb into bed with him. So he sends word to Sigrid's husband, who's Thorstein the farmer, and says, come on up here and control your wife. So Thorstein rushes up. When he enters, she had reached the sideboards of the bed, so she's like slowly creeping to the bed. God. It says he took hold of her and drove an axe into her breast, thus ending the threat of becoming a cuckold. To Thorstein Eriksson. I think it's a great moment to see this undead woman taking an axe to the breast. But I think your Uniped shooting the arrow is a little bit better.
You think just for the uniqueness of that death?
Yeah, we see other undead characters taking arrows and axes and such in the sagas, but we never see a Uniped shooting people.
Right.
So, a good winner for best bloodshed.
Right. A one of a kind for Thorvald. Body count. Okay, a body count. Once again, we've had to sort out some inconsistencies. This time, not just between our two individual counts, but of course also between the two different versions of this saga.
Yeah, it's turned out to be a little problematic when we discovered we were reading different translations or different translations from different manuscripts.
Right. And so what we ended up with was an initial count that varied by some 50-odd people.
Right.
And what we've established, well, in some cases in this saga, we actually get specific numbers of the dead. We had one instance, the sinking of Bjarni's ship late in the saga. I think it's worth just having a quick look at that moment.
If you'd say so.
Bjarni Grimolfsson's ship was blown into the Greenland Sea. They found themselves in waters infested with maggots, and before they knew it, the ship was riddled under them and had begun to sink. Now, putting aside this waters infested with maggots, and what we're dealing with here is shipworm. Mm-hmm. And the ship is rapidly sinking. They have one ship's boat which has been treated with tar made from seal blubber that is supposed to be impregnable to these maggots. And so they all want to get off the ship, but only about half of them can fit in the boat. Now, in my reading of the text, I'd assumed that since we're told just under half the men of the ship drown with the ship, we were looking at a number around 50 men. Mm-hmm. Possibly somewhere around 49 men drown with this ship.
Or perhaps 47.
Or perhaps 47, because Andy insists on being arbitrary about these numbers.
Could be 48.
But as Andy pointed out, and I think correctly, the 100 men who are said to be with Bjarni, we aren't guaranteed that all 100 of them are on the ship with him. Those 100 men are with him on land, but in their ships, we aren't sure if they've divided up the men the same way that they were divided up on land.
Right. So unfortunately, we had to not count those men.
But right, which is terrible because we're pretty sure we know within one or two how many there are.
Right. So we'll give you a range here. Now, as far as definite deaths in the saga, we count 39. So our body
39.
count officially is 39. But if you want to add in...
Right. Now that's 30 men from Iceland and Greenland, and then 9 Skraelings who are reported to have been killed.
That's right. Now, if you want to count, and you're a stickler and you really want those dead bodies from the boat, then it bumps our number up significantly.
Probably to 88.
Around 88, exactly. So, 39 definite and 88 probable.
Nicknames.
All right, and here we are in our nicknames category. I'm going to start off with a simple one. He's not a very important character. Again, we have a bunch of those.
Well, this is actually, when you start looking at this saga, for a short saga, we've got a lot of good nicknames, but they're mostly people who aren't terribly important to the saga. It's sort of the same problem we have with Hrafnkel saga.
Exactly. So let's start off. I'll give you a quick one. Earl Thorfinn Skullsplitter, who is in an arranged marriage from Out the Deep Mind sets up a marriage for someone in the beginning of the saga. She marries someone off to a guy named Earl Thorfinn Skullsplitter. Great name.
Perhaps you've enjoyed his ale. If you've never had a Skullsplitter ale, you really should try one.
Yeah.
I, of course, have to mention Eirik the Red,
Good.
Whose nickname means one of two things, right? We've already said either his red hair or his sort of bloody hands. I like to think that it means both, and it's merely a happy coincidence that sort of either one applies.
I have to throw in Thorbjord Shipbreast.
Of course you do.
I wish that she was a bigger part of the saga. If only her presence...
You don't think There's nothing I can say that is going to be dirty, so we'll just move on.
If only her presence in the saga were as large as her ships.
She's got huge tracts of land. Her nickname is Knarabringu, which there is no other way to translate that except ship breast.
Do you think she has...
Oh, let's not do that.
No, we're not doing that.
My next nominee is Eyolf Saur. Eyolf is his name literally means filth or the beshitten. You can also find him translated as the foul.
The foul, yeah.
So in this case, where a name like this might, we might be tempted to think of it as referring to his character. In this case, it may actually refer to his sort of physical presence. Mm-hmm. that Eyjolf is just a dirty man who doesn't wash.
He's like Pigpen walking around with flies and filth all over him.
Right, if you can picture this sort of small cloud following him around.
Yeah, it's no wonder that Eirik killed him. So, in that same episode, you see Hraven the Dueler, or Hraven Holmgangu.
Speaking of people that Eirik has killed.
Yeah, there's two people that Eirik killed. Filth Eyjolf, or Beschitten Eyjolf, and Hraven the Dueler. Those are both good nicknames. I'm going to throw in Leif the Lucky. And it's worth pausing over because he's really the big character as far as like name recognition in this saga. So I want to give you a sense of why he's called Leif the Lucky. So Leif gets his nickname because when he sets out on his journey from Olaf Tryggvason's place to go and convert Greenland, he gets tossed about at sea for a really long time, and he chances upon what becomes known as Vinland. He sees all those self-sown wheat fields, the vines growing there, and all the trees, all the cool things that he finds. And then on his way home, he also stumbles upon a shipwreck where he finds a bunch of people, and he helps them get their way home, and he shows his strong character and kindness. And because of that journey, he's given the nickname Leif the Lucky. Mm-hmm. And now you know.
But it's a great name. I mean, in a culture that prizes luck the way this one does, to have a nickname like the Lucky, that's a great nickname to have. It says a lot about you. It speaks well of your success in general, that people think this is an appropriate name for you.
Absolutely. And it almost maybe in Christian terms, it would be like being called Leif the Blessed.
Right, exactly right. I'm going to give us another minor character, Thord Horsehead.
It's a great name.
But more importantly, his son, Thorfinn Thortharsson, who we've been calling Karlsefni, which is actually a nickname. Karlsefni means the makings of a man, or according to Cleesby Vigfusson, a man of sterling quality.
Yeah. It's too bad the saga doesn't tell us more about him, so that we can say,
because
that nickname's really fitting. Now, we don't know a whole lot about him, so it's just a cool nickname.
Yeah, so loosely translated, it means sort of manly man, right? A man of high quality, or if you speak internet, Chuck Norris.
All right, I'm going to throw in a real tough guy, Thorhall the Huntsman. He is known as a silent man who's not generally given to conversation. He's devious and insulting in his speech. He's generally a troublemaker and a heathen. He's called the Huntsman. Because you know why? You know why he's called the Huntsman, John?
He's a huntsman?
Yeah, he likes to hunt. He's good at it. So that is the
collection of close reading skills coming into play.
That's our collection of nicknames for this time around.
I don't think there's really any contest here.
Yeah, it's definitely...
I'll give you the pleasure of announcing the winner.
We want to bring to the stage and put our arms around Thorbjord Shibreast.
Right. The two of us together trying desperately, collectively, to get our arms around. Congratulations, Thorbjord.
Yeah, yet another award to put on your shelf.
Oh, dear God. Notable witticisms. All right, and for notable witticisms, my first nominee is going to have to be Karlsefni, who, when we first meet him, spends a winter with Eirik the Red in Greenland. After having spent some time there, Christmas is drawing near, and Eirik is sort of seen moping around the homestead. And Karlsefni speaks to him and says, "Is something wrong with you?" And Eric's response is, "You have accepted my hospitality with courtesy and good grace. It does not occur to me to think that our dealings with one another will bring you any discredit. Rather it is this. I should not like it to be said that you have had to endure such a meagre Christmas as the one that is now approaching." Now Karlsefni, who of course understands the subtext in what Eirik is saying, responds with, "There's no question of that, Eirik. We have malt and flour and grain in our cargoes, and you are welcome to have as much of them as you wish, and prepare as rich a feast as your generosity demands." And I love that. This is sort of fantastic saga understatement. Karlsefni understanding what's being asked of him. He's essentially being asked to give Eirik his food stores, and doing so, and underscoring, of course, that it's Eric's generosity that needs to be on display here. And so Karlsefni is going to bankroll Eric's generosity.
Right.
And of course, that line does come with a price, because Eirik is able to swan about and give a high Christmas for all of his followers.
Right. It's
and
said
shortly
to be
after that.
It's said to be the greatest Yuletide feast anyone can remember.
Right. For he doesn't stint with Karlsefni's goods.
Right. He takes it all.
Right. And of course, Karlsefni then, as the unspoken price for this, then asks for the hand of Gudrid, who is now living in Eric's household. And of course, Eric has little choice but to agree.
Yeah. One of the interesting things in this saga, and this episode maybe highlights that in a subtle way, is just how bad life in Greenland really was. Like, nobody has any food or any
famine
joy,
is pretty
really,
regularly a feature.
Yeah, I mean, part of the reason they're exploring Vinland is because there's just nothing good going on in Greenland.
Mm-hmm. Well, remember when Leif returns, all he wants to talk about is Christianity, and all anybody else wants to talk about is a land of plenty that he's just come from.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Forget about this Christianity thing.
Right.
Tell me where there's food.
Wait, we heard you had food?
Yes, exactly.
Tell us about the place where there's food.
Right. So, speaking of Vinland, I'm going to throw in for my notable witticism something that Thorhall the huntsman, or Thorhall the hunter, says. Basically, when they're eating their whale meat, they've boiled all the whale meat and they're feasting, and suddenly they're a little bit sick. Thorhall boasts, not knowing that everyone's getting sick, and he says, "Didn't old Redbeard prove to be more help than your Christ? This was payment for the poem I composed about Thor, my guardian, who seldom disappointed me." And of course, old Redbeard is Thor, and this pagan religion doesn't provide good things for Christians.
Right, which, as you pointed out before we started recording, is kind of a theme of this saga.
Yeah.
The casting off of pagan ritual and pagan behaviors.
It seems to be all the saga is really about. It is, of course, about exploring the new world, but it's really much more, or maybe it's about two things. It's kind of two sagas smushed together. Mm-hmm. You have one saga that is about the conversion of Greenland and a kind of anti-pagan narrative, and then the other saga that is the latter half of it is really more about a travel narrative where they're exploring kind of the wonders of some distant land.
Right.
They don't balance together very well, actually.
Well, but actually, speaking of that travel narrative part, my other nominee for Best Witticism, we've got to go back to Thorvald Eriksson, who we last left dying with a Uniped's arrow in his groin. But Thorvald doesn't die without getting a last line in. He pulls that arrow out of his lower abdomen and says, "This is a rich country we have found. There's plenty of fat around my entrails." And then he dies of his wound shortly thereafter.
That's the fat around his entrails. Well, you know, and the translation that I've got, because I was working from a different manuscript, is equally funny. It says, Thorvald drew the arrow out and spoke. "Fat paunch that was. We found a land of fine resources, though we'll hardly enjoy much of them." So you have that image of him looking down at his fat stomach and saying, "We did pretty well here."
Right. Everything was going so well until I was shot by an arrow.
Yeah. And again, it underscores that issue of how bad things are in Greenland and the paucity of resources that they've got, and they're looking for a place where they can get fat, like apparently Thorvald has. And that leads me to my final entry for notable witticisms. And again, I'm going to Thorhall, and it captures nicely the kind of disappointment that Thorhall feels when he's wandering around hungry in Greenland. He composes a poem as he's getting ready to sail away. He writes, "With promises of fine drinks, the war trees wheedled, spurring me to journey to these scanty shores. War oak of the helmet god, I now wield but a bucket. No sweet wine do I sup, stooping at the spring." So there's all these promises of Vinland, wineland, right? You're going to be, there's enough food for your animals, enough food for everybody, and here I am stooping at a spring, and all I've got is a bucket, and we just got sick on dirty whale meat.
Well, and of course, this speaks to what you were saying about the pagan versus Christian elements of the story, that the promised land, this land of plenty that they don't find until the pagan group among them have kind of gone off their own way and left them.
Exactly. It's kind of weird, you know, when you think about all the sagas, you don't run into many sagas where so many of the characters are Christian.
True.
From almost the very beginning.
True.
Really, the pagans, or the what we would consider the normal characters in the sagas, they're the odd man out in this one, because everyone seems to be Christian, and it's very, very much if you don't do things Christ's way, you're not doing it the right way. That's not typical of the sagas.
No. So what are we going to choose for our notable witticism?
Oh, I don't think we can pass up Thorvald's fat paunch. I mean, again,
Thorvald is sweeping the awards.
He is. He's brilliant. I mean,
but it's a great line.
Yeah, it's good. So we'll give it to Thorvald for his witty death comment.
For the fat around his entrails.
Outlawry.
All right, so now we move into our category Outlawry, where we don't have a ton of characters to choose from, simply because there's not a whole lot of bad stuff that happens in the saga outside of getting hungry, getting sick, or getting attacked by natives. Now, I don't think we're going to be outlawing any natives for doing what they do.
Well, and of course, there is one notable exception to the nothing bad happens.
Yeah, there is one guy that kind of runs around and does outlaw-y type things, and he even earns himself a couple outlawries.
Yes.
So maybe the best candidate here is our own title character, Eirik the Red.
Right, now we've never outlawed the title character of a saga.
No.
And I can't imagine it's going to happen very often.
Right.
I think there's a real case to be made for him, and we know he's outlawed from Norway, which is why he ends up in Iceland in the first place. Right, over some killings. We don't know how many.
Right.
He's then outlawed from Iceland over killings. Mm-hmm. He returns from that. He has another brawl in Iceland, and after that's over, he has to leave again, and he ends up in Greenland. And essentially at that point, there's no one to outlaw him anymore, which is the only reason why he doesn't end up being thrown out of Greenland, I imagine.
Yeah, and as the founder of the settlement, he's kind of the big boss there anyways.
Right.
So who's going to say when you come and settle and take land, he divvies out the land.
Right.
Who's going to say, Eric's a bad guy, we need to outlaw him from the land he gave me?
But we have to remember that the only reason he's there establishing the settlement in Greenland is that no one wanted him anywhere else.
Exactly. So maybe that's where he belongs.
Well, we can also mention Thorhall the Hunter, who is clearly an outcast in the saga. As you said, he's kind of, because he's part of this pagan past, he's kind of on the outside looking in the group.
Exactly.
He's generally regarded as being an unpleasant figure. No one likes him very much.
I think I gave his brief description earlier, but I'll say it again. He's described as a silent man, not generally given to conversation, devious and yet insulting in his speech, a real troublemaker. But, his only crime is that, at least in this saga, as far as we know, is he's kind of grumpy, a little bit insulting, causes some trouble, and he's a heathen or a pagan.
He nearly poisons the entire company by praying for rancid whale meat.
Well, I don't know that he was praying for rancid whale meat. It just happened to be rancid whale meat.
Right.
He was certainly proud when his prayer was answered.
That's true. He actually was pretty pleased about it.
Exactly. So he intended good things, it seems.
There you go.
But it's, again, the author doesn't like the pagans, and so makes it rancid whale meat.
And a third option, we have Eolf Sar, Eolf the Beshitten, or Eolf Filth.
Why would we outlaw him? Because he stinks?
Well, because his name doesn't suggest somebody you'd want in the neighborhood.
That's true. So we just bring him to court and outlaw him because he's dirty. That doesn't seem fair, John.
He's chronically unwashed and therefore unacceptable. No, I think you're right. I think, unbelievably, and this is going to make the Thingman section really difficult, but I think we have to outlaw Eirik the Red.
I think so too. I know when we started, talking about this podcast, we were thinking, well, the Thingman section is going to be weird because a lot of times we're just going to be taking the title character. But this is a great instance very early on that we're going to indeed outlaw the title character.
Yep.
Sorry, Eirik.
Bye, Eirik.
I don't know where you're going this time, but you got to leave.
Thingman.
So we flipped a coin before we began recording, and Andy won but chose to defer because he doesn't want to have to pick out of the slim pickings in this saga. And frankly, especially with Eirik gone, I don't blame you.
No. Aside from name recognition, what would you really be gaining from these goofy Greenlanders?
I mean, you've got Leif Erikson, obviously. Leif the Lucky. I mean, he's probably one of the 6 or 7 most famous figures in the sagas.
And certainly in America, everyone, I shouldn't say everyone, we're not that bright, generally speaking. But
as you noted on our Twitter page, he has his own day.
Right, Leif Erikson Day.
And honestly,
he's discoverer of America, but what does he do in the saga?
Exactly. I mean, in this saga, he is he's blown off course, and therefore gets a brief sort of glimpse of Vinland, but doesn't stick around. He's too busy trying to fulfill his obligations to Olaf Tryggvason. He never returns. He's not part of the group that comes back. That his part in the saga is really a fairly small one. the only other thing we can say for him is that he does sleep with and impregnate Thorgunna, who's a pretty terrifying woman. So I guess that's a fairly impressive feat.
Yeah, well done. He lends name recognition to your group if you choose him.
Right.
So that's nice. The other thing that's interesting about Leif is he kind of represents the New Age Viking for this author. It's to say that Vikings, if you think about what a Viking used to be, it was a guy that went around killing and taking what he wants and then going home and selling it, or that kind of thing. Leif does the journey, does the travel, does the exploration that is appropriate to a Viking, but he does so in a very peaceful manner.
Right.
And maybe that's part of the reason that we don't see him getting involved in a lot of conflict, because we need to keep his hands clean.
Well, and he actually, the company that he puts together, the company that he keeps in Greenland, the ones who eventually return to the New World without him, they're mostly traders, they're mostly farmers. We're not told that there are great Vikings among them.
No, definitely not. And again, I think it's an author that's looking forward to a new way of doing business. It's clearly someone who rejects the old ways, and there's really not a lot of emphasis on pre-Christian Iceland in this saga at all. Right,
which brings us to, I think, probably the only other legitimate choice we have before us, Karlsefni, Thorfinn Karlsefni, who we're told is a manly man.
Very manly.
But who, again, is not a Viking. He's a trader. He's an import-export merchant.
That's nice.
That's what he is. He's a ship's captain.
But apparently not even that successful, because in this saga, the journey, I mean, if you look at Greenlander, they do have some successes, but in this one, it's not a successful trip.
No, not really.
A lot of people die. They don't come back with a lot of money.
But aside from the fact that his son is born there, nothing else of positive note really occurs.
Yeah, so it's hard to choose from these guys, isn't
right?
It?
And I'm trying to think if there's anyone else that I would want to be supporting me, and I really don't think there is. So my choice is between the name recognition of Leif Erikson or the sort of manliest, best protagonist of the saga, Karlsefni,
who isn't really talked about at all.
Right. And you know what? I'm still trying to make up for having probably the most obscure figure in either one of our teams with Thorkel Streak. So I'm going to have to go with Leif Erikson. I want a little bit of name recognition. I want the man who gets credited for discovering the New World, whether or not he actually does anything there.
Right. Well, I mean, that makes sense, and I knew that would happen. I was willing to give up old Leif the Lucky. Now I have to make my decision, and I have to start with a question. And yes. I didn't ask you beforehand. When we started this whole thing and talked about what Thingmen would count and would not count, I believe we said something like, if a character is mentioned and plays a significant role in the saga, you can choose him as your Thingman. Is that right?
Yes.
Something like that, anyway.
Significant role. Yes.
Roughly, vaguely significant, plays a role in the
Now it's vaguely significant.
Well, okay. Plays a role in the saga.
Just where are you heading
part
with
of the
this?
Action. Well, I'm looking at the characters, and I didn't really care to have Leif, and Thorfinn doesn't blow me away. But I do remember...
He's a manly man.
He's manly, but not manly enough for me. I'm looking for someone who's a little bit more reliable, and I'm looking for someone who maybe has a bigger name, a little bit more power and clout in Iceland. You've got a Greenland.
In this saga?
In this saga, yeah. So I go back to the beginning of the saga, where we have Eirik getting into all of his troubles. Mm-hmm. And if you remember, in one of the occasions, the Thorgest feuds, Eirik gets the help of one Killer Stur, who we remember from Eyrbyggja saga. And Stur is exactly the kind of guy I want on my side. He's wealthy. He is politically powerful. He is extremely strong and a good fighter. He's
would you argue that he has a significant role in this saga?
In this instance, I would, yes.
Is this a desperation move on your part?
Yes, it is.
Oh boy!
But I would note he does have a significant role. He plays a role in the action of this saga. He's part of Erik's story. I don't see why we shouldn't choose him.
I'm going to say this: if you can live with your conscience, you go ahead and you choose him.
Well, you know what? In the posterity, when we're just looking at the list, everyone's just going to see Killer Stoor there and not remember this episode. So I'm going to choose Killer Stoor as my Thingman and count it as a victory for myself.
Wow. That is appalling. That is just appalling.
What do you think of those machinations, John?
What do I think of that? I think it's very Snorri-esque. I probably should have left him for you to choose.
I learned from the master.
Final rating.
So final ratings for this saga. I have to say, I came into this episode pretty sure I was not going to be going overboard on Eirik's saga. Now that we're ready to give our ratings, I can say for sure I was right. It's never been a particular favorite of mine. The Vinland stuff is really interesting. Sure. But the saga is actually pretty thin on details about the place, to the extent that even people in the saga weren't sure where to find it when they went back looking for it. The story lacks a lot of the things that I want in a saga. There isn't really a central feud. The character studies are pretty rudimentary, and I'm not sure I know anything more about Eirik or Leif or Thorfinn at the end of this saga, except that Eirik's got a mean temper, Leif was lucky, and Thorfinn Karlsefni led a bunch of men overseas and back.
Right. You don't even get really good stories to associate with those identifications, right?
I mean, there are some fun things in the stories, but in the end, it's significant that you, for example, had to go outside the action to find a Thingman. It's just not my kind of saga. I'm going to give it a 3, and I'll tack on a half point for the Uniped, because I'm happy to have a Uniped in the sagas. So I'll give it a 3.5.
That's good. Yeah, that seems a little bit harsh, if only because this is one of our only sagas where we travel to the New World.
Sure.
And there's a kind of a curiosity to this saga that other ones may lack, because you see the same basic feuding and story over and over and over again. So for that, I'm not going to go as low as 3. But like you, I don't think this is a very entertaining saga. It's so thin. All the characters are so thinly drawn. There's really not much that happens in this episode. But we do have some pretty cool exchanges with the Native Americans. We've got the Uniped. I'm going to go ahead and give it a 4 because I think it's interesting. So I'm only going a half point above you.
All right, so it's a 3.5 for me and a 4 for Andy, and that gives us a total of 7.5 for this saga, which is our lowest total yet.
I'm sure we can get lower if we want. If we really
I feel confident that we will at some point.
Yeah.
We're only 3 sagas in. We've got a long ways to go.
But up next, we have a really good one. We're going to be doing Gisli's saga.
One of your favorites, I know, and one of mine as well.
It's a good outlaw saga. We get a little backstory on Snorri the Gothe's family, so it's always nice for that kind of thing.
My Thingman follower and friend, Snorri the Gothe.
And I will be choosing first for Thingman in that, having deferred this time around. Certainly part of the strategy. But until we meet for our next episode, go ahead and check us out on our website, sagathingpodcast.wordpress.com. Follow us on Twitter at sagathingpod, and like us on our Facebook page, Saga Thing Podcast. Like I said at the beginning, if you download us at iTunes, make sure you subscribe and leave a comment. And we will see you next time.
Bye for now. All right, I'm gonna get you a little doll, and you can point to where you think the groin is.